As Corey previously mentioned, I'm Annie, and though I myself am from Montreal, the land known as Tiohtià:ke, we are otherwise mainly located on a chunk of Turtle Island called British Columbia. This land has been stolen. We acknowledge and thank the Indigenous peoples and First Nations communities across this land for allowing us to live, work, and play on their lands. I'd like to mention the Healthy Voices. All genders voice training is there. They're facilitated by Anna Lantry, who's a voice coach. There should be a link for more information at the top of the chat. And as a reminder, if you're wanting to enter to win the Crave subscription, please make sure that you've RSVP'd on the website. We'll be drawing the winner on December 30th. However, we'll be contacting the individual at relatively, yes, that is a good idea. Relatively soon after, we'll be contacting relatively soon after. Feel free to have your video on or off as you're comfortable. And you can change your name if you'd like to include your pronouns by right-clicking on your image or video. Now, Nicola mentioned will be our chat moderator for today. She'll keep you muted while the conversation is going. So feel free to chat in the chat box during this during the panel. And if you have a question, please type in question followed by your question, and Nicola will pass it on to our host and producer. Our tech person tonight, as mentioned, is Christy. If you have any tech questions, please type tech and then mention your tech issue. We also have Rebecca, who will be providing cultural and emotional support. If you're needing someone to talk to, then send a private message to Christy or Nicola, and one of them will move you over to the proper breakout room. Lastly, as I mentioned, we're not going to be able to show the Matrix Resurrections on the 29th due to restrictions and availability of the movie online, though we do hope to still be able to have the panel, which at this point will be in content. We'll be mentioning it when it happens at a later date. Oh, now as for our host and producer Corey, Corey uses the pronouns per and pers. Corey Keith coordinates PER's own private practice through peer counseling, consulting, and workshops in the areas of sexuality and gender since 2006, focusing on gender and sexuality diversity, relationships, communication, and mindfulness. PER has also worked with OCHI for the last 3 years of various contract coordinating and different projects. So send that back to you, Corey.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So before we get into things, I would like to introduce Rebecca, who will be helping out with the wellness room, doing cultural and emotional support if folks so need it. Do you want to say something, Rebecca?
Sure. I love talking. Thank you for having me again. Have a happy day, and I'll be sitting in the wellness if you need support. I'm Rebecca Hay from Curve Lake First Nation, which is by Toronto. Presently, I'm on Lekwungen land in Victoria, and I'm blessed to sit with you and hold space for you. And I love spending Saturdays with you. Thank you so much for having me. So I'll be in the wellness room. Have a beautiful session.
Thank you so much. So I'm just going to get myself organized here. And I'm wondering if Chris, were you able to give Pete sharing ability? Cool, brilliant. So I'm wondering if you, Pete, if you wanted to go first.
Um, you mean in terms of just what would you like me to say, and give me a time interval that you'd like me to say it within?
5 minutes or something along those lines?
And what would you like me to speak to specifically? My expertise
Anything,
or?
yeah, anything that you want to speak to in terms of matrix, science, physics, anything along those lines, yes.
Alrighty. Gosh, I'm always a bit nervous to be the person going first, but I guess one way to begin is just to introduce myself in terms of positionality. I am currently coming to you from land that is part of Treaty 13 and also under the Dish with One Spoon Treaty. And the land has been is most recently traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit, etc. But there's also longer history with other nations as well. And I grew up in Aotearoa, more recently known as New Zealand, and I did all my schooling and my undergraduate work there. And then I went off to America in 1990 for a grand adventure for grad school and stayed in North America. I'm now a professor of physics working at the University of Toronto. And I've been here for 21 years and a bit so far, so I'm older than I am sometimes assumed to be. Up until age 39, I was still getting carded every time I went to buy alcohol. So at least now with the grey hairs, they tend not to do that to me so often. My ancestry is from the UK, Welsh, Scottish, Irish, both the green and orange kinds, and English. So that's where my ancestors trace back to. My parents, my dad is a retired chemical engineering professor, and my mum is an adult and community education expert who has also worked in schooling as a teacher quite a long time ago. I'm interested in the physics of gravity, including phenomena like black holes and the Big Bang. And I study this primarily through the lens of theoretical subatomic physicist. I'm not useful in the lab. You don't want me anywhere near your lab equipment because probably just by standing near it, I will break it just because of my incompetence. But I'm quite good with equations and math and things like that. And I study specifically the question of how we might make a quantum theory of gravity. And the main approach that I use in my work is one of the approaches to the idea of making a theory of building a theory of quantum gravity called string theory. And that's just one of the approaches. There are others that I'm not an expert on. So I am not married to this particular approach to quantum gravity. And I don't treat it like an organized religion. It's just, it seems to me to have the best number of features and the fewest number of bugs for addressing the kinds of physics questions that I'm interested in addressing. I also want to make clear that as a hard scientist, I really value all of the other disciplines that are under one roof when we're at a university or more generally. So the arts and the humanities and the social sciences for me are at least as valuable as the kind of work that I do. And also I want to just mention that I also value other long-standing knowledge systems and epistemologies that have arisen outside of the context of the rather Eurocentric university system that I work in, including Indigenous knowledges, plural. So yeah, if you have a question about, quantum theory of gravity or string theory or extra dimensions or multiverses, holography, those sorts of buzzwords, then I'm your person. And I use they, them, their, themselves pronouns. If you ever wonder, by the way, should you say something like they are or they is when you're trying to figure out which verb to pick, the rule that always works is to pick the same one as you would use for the singular you. So if you would say you are going to the bathroom, you would just say they are going to the bathroom. It's a super simple rule and it works for all verbs, regular and irregular. I think I'll stop now because as a white person, I don't want to, take up too much space, and somebody who's masculine side of the spectrum, be good to let others have some room. So that's me.
Cool. Thank you so much. And we're definitely going to be talking about quantum gravity, string theory, holographic principles, all of those things. And in terms of the irony is, if we had all the panelists here, everyone would be presenting on the masculine side of the spectrum, which is fascinating. And always, my intention is always trying to get as much mixture as possible, but sometimes this is the way it evolves. So I'm going to pass things off to Jeff to say whatever you want to say.
Great, great. Thanks, Corey. Yeah, I'm excited to be here, and I was supposed to be on last week's panel, and all sorts of things happened. I probably slid down another rabbit hole, and it was just a bit of a crazy thing. And so, but Revolutions is, I would say, kind of my favorite movie. So it kind of makes sense to, in that context, you know, sort of speak to a number of different things and have a jam with people there. And I'm originally from Regina, which is Treaty 4 territory. It's a land, it's a incredible land. It's a crazy land though too. The Cree, the Blackfoot, there's Dene in the north. I think there's Sutu as well. That's the land of Sutu. Treaty 4 is a big treaty area, and I've been lucky enough to live on there and dwell there, thanks to First Nations folks, most of my life. Then I spent time in my graduate work. I learned, I studied, I transformed in different ways at the University of Regina. I spent time doing an English philosophy degree, a bachelor's degree, then went on to an honors degree in so-called political science. I was mixing and matching so many different things. I don't even know why they allowed me to do what I was doing. It was, I think, quite heretical in almost any department there, although U of R had and has a history of incredibly interesting stuff going on there, including as it emerged, one of the only universities in Canada at the time without any sort of faculties. It was just every prof was in the same pool, and there was a very little division between professor and student. And then there were crazy things that happened at the U of R. You know, so many Marxists came up from the States. People escaping the Vietnam War. Same thing, in fact, at York University, where I did my graduate work. But it introduced me to a lot of, you know, different ways of thinking, different ways of seeing. And of course, U of R is known to be, you know, a place where there were people in the faculty of psychology doing research on psychedelics, particularly LSD. So and you know, I couldn't tell you, frankly, what land the York University is on, but probably most of you will be familiar with that area. It was a wonderful experience I had there, opened me to so much. I was studying in what was called and is called the Social and Political Thought program. And it was perfect for me because it allowed me to really take on a new level of interdisciplinarity. So I've always been, you know, interested in, if you will, liberal education as something that is at once general but very specific and really takes on everything. You know, university is about the universe and nothing is left out now. When we speak about multiverse, perhaps that extends it even further. So I now live in Victoria, and much of my research in philosophy, if you will, has been in really sort of applied stuff where I would be looking at adopting a number of different methods, including phenomenology, critical theory, and really thinking about anything really, from popular culture to popular music, to films, and that's the way I was tending to take it, generally speaking. But that gets you into all sorts of interesting areas of, I think, society. You know, I've always been interested in this connection between what we might call, you know, the making of art and what it means to be a social being. And so that's what really propelled me to be you know, investigating philosophy. But it wasn't just philosophy. You know, philosophy is in general just the love of wisdom, the befriending of wisdom for the Greeks, and that means that it can surveil anything. It can adopt anything. It is, as one person put it, parasitical. So there's a lot of different things you can do with that I would say extend the boundaries of philosophy. And And I just want to add as well that that's what's so interesting about this session, and this what would you call it? It's not a typical convention, but it's something like that discussion. I at the U of R began really piloted a course on philosophy through film, and The Matrix was a critically motivating aspect of that. And I think that when I think about films and philosophy, I really think about, you know, this unique intersection. So much so, I would say that the films, the trilogy, soon to be a quartet, if you will, you know, they constitute a way of doing philosophy, I think. So it's not just about, you know, here we have a number of metaphors or allegories, or we have a vehicle for the transcription or interpretation of philosophy, but we have the performance of philosophy. So I think that's where I am in a lot of different ways. And I think that means that, you know, philosophy is something that we do instead of just sort of contemplate. It's something we enact. And I suppose, you know, my Marxian background supports that in not a dogmatic way, but philosophy as something that is about praxis. And that means that it is something that is made, something that is fabricated, something that is created. As all really systems of thought are, you know, whether it is, you know, deductive logical systems, or, you know, other methodologies in critical thinking, which I've taught a lot in. I think we're talking about frameworks, we're talking about human creations. And this is not to suggest that in that we are alienated, you know, we are creating ourselves through those things. So that's a bit about me.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. So we have a couple new people joining us here. So I'm just going to have you two on mute, just as we having our folks speak as we dive into the questions. And so I want to open up with a quote from Einstein, one of our favorite. I would say this is kind of perfect, because he was definitely a scientist, but he definitely was not afraid to dive into philosophy either. So I think it's perfect to open with him. He said, reality is an illusion, albeit a very persistent one. And so as we dive into this conversation, we're going to dive into how much is that real? How much is it not? What is real? What is, you know, all of these, the term even real is an abstract concept. So as we dive into things, we'll pull some of those pieces apart and go from there. So what I wanted to do is maybe start with the science end of things, and maybe ask, because just so we have a frame of reference, because, you know, when I started in my school program, I started in physics and geophysics. So I have a basic understanding of what science and the scientific method is, but I don't think that is an understanding a lot of folks have. And I think it's going to, can Pete, you describe what that is, so we have a framework in terms of the frame that you're coming from? Oh,
whoops. This is a really, really large question. I want to be succinct in trying to give an answer. I mean, one of my nieces, when they were younger, asked me, so, you know, what's physics good for? What do physicists grow, auntie? And a little taken aback. And then I sort of thought, well, basically what a physicist likes to do is to try to understand some system that we can observe in nature, whether it's with our own eyes and our own hands, or with a telescope, or with a microscope, or something else. And so a physicist is interested in looking at a system that they think, that might be interesting. And then we basically poke it and see what happens. So the physicists often will describe ourselves as being one of the following three types of physicist, or perhaps one or two of those three fields. One of them is experimental, where people really do measurements, design experiments to measure the properties of a certain physical system or systems that they're interested in and find out the results. Theorists like me are interested in using the power of mathematics and ideas of theoretical physics to model at a theoretical level, like to have some underlying way of understanding the phenomena that the experimentalists have measured. And there are also computational physicists, now that computers are powerful enough to really be a big major force in doing physics. So there's a lot of interactions and interchanges between computational physicists, experimental ones, experiments and theorists, all the different types of physicists interact, and some people manage to do more than one of those things well. So one of the things that comes up when you're thinking about something like the entire cosmos is, what is this thing that people have called gravity? After all, what is that as a concept? Is it real? How do I feel it? And Newton had a theory of gravity. He was the first one to really write down a model to describe a number of celestial and terrestrial experimental data. And people, thought rah Newton, because he was good at describing more than one thing, the trajectory of a ball that you throw up in the air, or the trajectory of a planet around our sun. They're described by the same mechanical ideas, according to Newton. Then Einstein came along later and said, I've got an upgrade. My theory of gravity is what I refer to now as gravity 2.0. So it's the version 2 of Newton's version 1. And like when you upgrade an operating system, the operating systems can become more powerful, but it also has backwards compatibility, that it can still do the things that the previous OS could do, but it's better and it can handle more situations. So Einstein's GR theory is like an upgrade on Newton's one. And Einstein's theory can handle situations where gravity isn't just weak, like between a couple of protons, or even the gravity between the Earth and the sun is not especially strong by the standards of other forces, like electromagnetic forces, like that causes the static electricity when you take your hat off in the winter. And then, so people like me who are interested in trying to find a theory of quantum gravity, we want to have an even better theory than Newton's theory. So we're trying to find gravity 3.0. And in the situations where Einstein's theory would still be applicable, we want whatever our theory of quantum gravity is to reduce back to that familiar thing, because that's already been very well tested. In the same way that in Einstein's theory, if you take a situation where gravity is weak everywhere and everything moves at a lot slower than the speed of light, then you actually do get back Newtonian gravity dynamics. And that simple way of describing things was sophisticated enough to let us land men on the moon. Right, so Newton's theory was already pretty great, but we're trying to reach for the stars and understand a theory of quantum gravity that would help us explain the most extreme situations in the universe. Is that helpful? I hope. Sometimes I get a bit excited when I'm talking about physics, so feel free to just stop me if I go on for too long.
No, that was awesome, because that leads me into the next period, because you're talking about the upgrade. And one of the things, the conversation around the next upgrade is around the conversation of the theory of general relativity and quantum mechanics. And they don't tend to play well together. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. What's the time envelope that you'd like me to describe it in? That just helps me decide how to answer the question.
Just very as quick, just because it's a very quick overall premise of the two theories. Okay. And how, yeah.
So general relativity, in a nutshell, describes the physics of very heavy things. And so it successfully described a lot of experiments. And GR conceptualizes gravity in terms of Einstein's picture of a smooth geometry of what we call the fabric of space-time, which is kind of like a substrate in which other things do things, like electrons move or planets go wherever. Quantum mechanics, on the other hand, is a different toolkit from 20th century physics. It describes the physics of very small things. It was also developed around a century ago-ish and has successfully explained many experiments. Quantum mechanics, though, teaches us at very small scales, subatomic scales, for example, inside atoms, that life isn't sort of continuous, it's actually granular and full of quantum jumps. It's not smooth in the way that Einstein's theory of gravity conceptualizes the fabric of space-time. Quantum mechanics has quantum jumps in it, like energy levels in atoms can only be very specific energies. And if you move from one energy level in an atom to another level, then you spit out light of a very specific frequency. That's partly how we identify what atom you've got. So quantum mechanics also has fundamental randomness baked into it. The classical notion of clockwork determinism of Newton's day, where if you could measure everything specifically enough at one moment, then you knew the equations of the universe, then you could evolve it forward and be absolutely certain of what was going to happen in the future. That was the Newtonian idea of determinism. But once quantum mechanics came along and really became entrenched, by about the 1930s, people were really beginning to understand how vital it was to understand all of the small scale physics. You can't understand, for example, how the chips in your cell phone work without quantum mechanics. But quantum mechanics only allows us to compute with confidence what the probability of something is if we would make a measurement. And that's a different type of determinism referred to as quantum determinism. So why GR and quantum mechanics can't play well together? Well, one of them is about a smooth fabric of space-time, and the other one is very jumpy and random. That's the essence of why they don't play well together. But I could give a more technical answer, but I shan't because I don't want to take up too much space.
Cool. Thank you so much. So that leads into, and you talked a little bit about this, some of the proposed solutions, although as you probably will get into, there's still lots of work to be done. And I guess you can probably tell us that's part of the fun is, let's talk about string theory. What is string theory? What kind of things does it solve? What problems are still there remaining with string theory?
Well, string theory is an idea about what constitutes the most fundamental building blocks of the universe, the Legos of the universe, if you like. So when we learned about, maybe we learned about atoms in school and molecules and stuff, and we learned then that the idea that we were taught about what was the most fundamental constituents of everything was little tiny particles, elementary particles with no structure to them, like electrons, or what we think of as protons, we think of as point-like particles. In fact, they have three little particles inside them called quarks and some gluons that glue them together to make those little subatomic particles. But we're taught that the idea of a particle, a point-like structureless thing, that must be the Lego of the universe because you can't divide it with a knife. But string theorists came along and said, well, let's impertinently think what would be different if the fundamental Legos of the universe were not point-like, but tiny little one-dimensional vibrating strands of energy. And those are what we call strings. The strings can be shaped like a rubber band. Those are called closed strings, or they can be open and have ends. Those are called open strings. And what string theorists were able to discover is that if you took the lowest type of vibration of an open string, that describes messenger particles for the electromagnetic force and for the strong and the weak nuclear forces. The strong force is what holds an atom nucleus together, and the weak nuclear force is responsible for radioactivity and the nuclear fusion reaction that goes on inside the sun. If you look at what's the lowest possible vibrational mode of the closed strings, you actually get the messenger particle for gravity. So if you just say, suppose that string theory are the fundamental Legos of the universe, what does that imply? You predict that gravity exists, among other things. So string theory has other things in it, like things called D-branes and Neveu-Schwarz 5-branes and complicated animals like that. And we can use open and closed strings and branes to build black holes for you and do a number of other things, including, for example, coming up with a working model of an idea called holography. So string theory aims to be a unified theory of all of the known interactions and the particles that interact with one another, including gravity. It wants to have a unified quantum theory of all the things, all the forces and all the particles that feel the forces, and even to describe the origin of space-time itself. And it hasn't reached those goals yet. We've only made partial progress towards those aims. And one of the things that string theory predicts, other than the existence of gravity, is extra dimensions of space-time. So 6 or 7 extra dimensions in superstring theory or M theory. And then one of the big puzzles of string theory to try to build very realistic models of the world that we see out there in the cosmos is, where are those extra dimensions hiding? And what properties of those extra dimensions might make an imprint on the physics that we might be able to measure so that we could say, aha, maybe it's string theory rather than one of those other theories of quantum gravity that's correct. So with all theories where you're trying to build something very sophisticated to handle all the situations, the challenge can often be to produce the very realistic theories of the world. But what you want is for there to be some sort of imprint, some clue from all of that complicated, super duper physics that would show up maybe in an experiment that we can do either by looking at the cosmos or smashing things together inside a particle collider.
Very cool. And I know one of the other things that string theory talks about the possibility of is the multiverse, which if you watch the MCU, this is a very big concept around that. So can you talk a little bit what that would mean if the multiverse was real?
This is an extremely gigantic area of consideration. So the word multiverse can mean different things to different people. It has lots of different senses in which even physicists use the word. So one of the ways that we might think of it, maybe there's some bigger universe that is sort of existing and propagating largely outside of what we can measure, and maybe our universe is just a small bang inside of a big multiverse, and there were other small bangs that those universes would have thought of as big bangs. So there might be other universes out there that we can't communicate with, but then the question is, how would we know about them if we can never get a signal? Another sense in which multiverse can arise in string theory is that since string theory comes about with 10 or 11 dimensions of space-time, then you have to get rid of the other 6 or 7 to make one that's relevant to our world, where there's up and down, side to side, and back and forth, and the 3 dimensions of space, and then 1 dimension of time. So if I say space-time is 4-dimensional, what I mean is that's what we have. So one of the things you can build in string theory is models where our universe would arise via these things called branes, which is essentially, I don't know, like a stack of membranes, and then there could be another set of branes over here, and the people living on this world would think that their world was all there was, and maybe the guys over here would think that their world was all there was, and each of those worlds would have 4 dimensions of space and time. But what if you could have things that could go between those branes and send little messages from one world to another? One option is, for example, some people think the way that our so-called Big Bang operated, how our cosmos was born in the first place, was that there was another brane that came along and crashed into ours, and the crashing energy dumped a whole bunch of energy into our universe and made it go bang. So that's one of the super imaginative ways that people have used ideas coming from string theory to envisage what kinds of other universes there might be. It's a super interesting question as to whether I can ever be in someone else's universe, and it depends on the type of specific model you're inventing to be imaginative about what universes we could be in. But one of the big messages from string theory is, if you think that that's the right theory of the world and a grand unified theory of everything, including gravity, then why is our universe the way it is? Why does it have 4 dimensions of space and time? Why are there 4 forces and not 7? Why are there 3 generations of quarks and leptons in the standard model of particle physics? Why is there a Higgs boson but only 1? All those kinds of the why questions about the universe. We hope that perhaps a sophisticated theory of quantum gravity or unified theory of everything might have a chance of explaining why our universe is the one that we live in. I mean, one obvious answer is, well, it has to have us in us. So if your universe that you built using your fancy pants string theory doesn't have the possibility of humans in it, well, then it's obviously wrong. So you'd better throw that model in the garbage bin and try again. So sometimes people code that as saying that there's something called the anthropic principle that says that if we're in the universe, then the universe has to have had certain properties, otherwise we wouldn't have been able to evolve. So yeah, I hope that goes some way towards answering it. But there's lots of different senses in which we talk about the idea of a multiverse. I think I saw it in the Spider-Man movie, Into the Multiverse or something, which was really cool. And I'm looking forward to the next one in that series, which I hope will exist.
I haven't seen it yet, but I am definitely looking forward to. So let's move into quantum gravity very quickly, because I want to switch over to talking to Jeff a little bit. What is quantum gravity?
quantum gravity is, simply put, the demand that we understand the theory of gravity not only at distances that we can measure with our hands or going out into the cosmos, that we can also understand gravity at very small length scales. So what a theory of quantum gravity is knowing what is the subatomic structure of space-time. The space-time being Einstein's conceptualization of the fabric of space-time is sort of the stage on which everything takes place. And so when you build a theory of quantum gravity, it's got to have gravity in it, and it's got to have quantum mechanics in it. And so the trouble is that if you naively just try to put them together, and if you want to know some reasons why, I can go into them, but I think it'd be better if I didn't right now, is if they won't marry one another, won't live under the same roof, then one of the principles has to give. And so loop quantum gravity says, I'm going to treat Einstein's theory of gravity and its symmetries and its knowledges as primary, and I'll try and modify quantum mechanics in some fashion to try to make sense of quantum gravity. String theorists take the other approach and say, I'm really confident in quantum physics. It describes a lot of condensed matter and quantum optics, like building a quantum computer. It describes all the things in particle colliders and all of cosmology as well. Why don't we modify gravity at short distances? We supersede Einstein's theory and we replace it with something more sophisticated. So that's really what you're trying to do when you're building a theory of quantum gravity, is to be able to understand the structure of space-time at very short distances, as well as the longer distances, which we've done experimental measurements at.
Cool. So one of the things I think really can blow people's minds around quantum gravity, as one scientist, Lee Smolin, suggests that because through the theory of quantum gravity, time is not real. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that, because that kind of blows our experience in daily life, is that we're going through moment by moment in this structure we call time. And can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, one thing we already knew from Einstein is that if you and I are in the universe and we're in the state of relative motion or even at relative acceleration compared to each other, then if we're watching something happen, like this event happens and then that event happens, you and I will actually disagree on the amount of time it took. So even before we bring in the story of quantum mechanics, we already know that time itself is not something that everybody can possibly agree on, as Newton imagined that we did, but in fact, that time is relative. So then one of the questions comes about, well, what even is time? How should we conceptualize it? Is it real? What do we mean by real? I mean, a lot of the question of what we think of as reality as a physicist comes around eventually to the question, well, can we do an experiment to measure something? And then what do we mean by doing a measurement? That's a process that is quite complicated when you're talking about the story of quantum mechanics, because of this randomness and uncertainty, and only being able to work with probabilities is a gnarly thing. I don't know if that really fully answers the question, but one of the things that we learned from this idea of holography that was invented first in the context of string theory by Juan Maldacena in late 1997 is the idea that we can understand when in certain circumstances we can grow an extra dimension of space-time just by considering having a large number of microscopic ingredients of the thing that we're going to build. So we know in the context of string theory and holography how to grow an extra dimension of space. And so then the question is, well, how many dimensions of space are there? That's a question that may not have a unique answer depending on how you choose to look at it from your model of the physics that's going on. So then the key question, well, how did time arrive? How did it start? Why was there a time, if we wind the clock back to when the Big Bang happened, or maybe even a little earlier, why was it the time didn't exist back then? How does time emerge from quantum gravity? Because after all, what we've discovered by trying to study quantum gravity is unless you can build a big space-time that can get classical, that you can not have to worry about quantum gravity physics. In order for a space-time to become very large, that's when you can measure space and time with rulers and clocks. But if you're in a very quantum regime of gravity, then even the fabric of space-time itself is not really very well defined. And you have to use the rules of quantum gravity to ask the questions, to think about doing the measurements. Something that makes it very complicated, though, is if you're trying to think of yourself as an observer of a system doing an experiment, well, what if the entire system is the cosmos? Because there's nothing outside the cosmos by definition, it's the whole banana. So if you're going to be talking about doing measurements in our cosmos, we have to be able to say, I'm separating off this part of the cosmos to study, and I'm going to be way over here doing the experiment with my arms or my telescope or whatever. So the whole question of who's an observer and how you do a measurement, it can get quite challenging conceptually.
For sure. Okay.
So Lee Smolin, just to clarify, Lee Smolin works on a different pathway to quantum gravity than the string theory pathway. It's called loop quantum gravity, and that envisages space-time is built out of granular things called spin networks and spin foams, and that's a different model for how the subatomic structure of space-time is involved. It has a big difficulty with being able to show, though, that it obeys the correspondence principle. In other words, if you looked at length scales far above the typical length scale of these spin foams, could you prove that you got back Einstein's theory of classical gravity? And I think even Lee would agree that that's something that's fairly challenging for the theory. But you know, I don't like to diss other people's approaches to doing physics. I don't think that's particularly productive. So I just say that loop quantum gravity has strengths that string theory doesn't, and string theory has strengths that loop quantum gravity doesn't. There are even other approaches like names like, I don't know, causal sets and dynamical triangulations and all of that. And ideally, we will have cross-fertilization of the ideas, and eventually maybe our ideas will converge. And when we finally figure out what the theory of quantum gravity is, I'm hoping that happens about 2 years before I die. So at least I get to find out what the answer is.
Indeed, indeed. All right, let's switch gears and talk about philosophy now. So one of the big, I think one of the foundational pieces to some of the matrix stuff is a concept called postmodernism. Can you describe what that is and how it relates to the matrix?
That's another big one. That's another big one, right? These are all big ones. And, you know, one of the things I'm thinking about is how to sort of, you know, not so much fuse, but work alongside, collaborate with, you know, if you will, a theoretical physicist, you know, sort of point of view. And I tend to think about Thomas Kuhn. So let me work through this guy named Thomas Kuhn, who was really important in establishing a kind of social understanding of science. And then I'll move into postmodernism. I think there's a connection there. I didn't think about this before as I was planning this, but it's kind of a nice way to think about this. So with Kuhn understood that you know, maybe it's best to start with someone like Newton. Newton understood that he's standing on the shoulders of others, and Einstein understood as well his position as, you know, an upgrade, as we call it, right? And you might even consider it a paradigm shift. This is how Kuhn talked about these things. So you have in science, genuine science, what he called revolutionary science, this notion of paradigm shift, in which a new understanding of science, or if you will, a new understanding of the nature of things. And so it could be complete, it could be physics, it could be biology, essentially replace an old paradigm. That new paradigm was essentially brought about because of anomalies in the earlier paradigm. So in that system, it threw up anomalies. You might consider them contradictions, thinking about the matrix. And those anomalies would essentially, as moments of negativity, if you will, you know, then sort of throw up this opportunity to, you know, expand, enlarge, revise, reinterpret that older, you know, whatever theory prevailed in that paradigm in such a way that there was the non-existence of the anomaly. So the anomaly would be taken care of. So I want to go into postmodernism because in some ways, what you see with postmodernism is not so much a movement of whether it's the aesthetic or the philosophical or even the scientific as a movement that attempts to, if you will, integrate the earlier into itself. So the idea that Kuhn is talking about is an idea of incorporation. So, you know, Einstein's theories, particularly time, space, gravity, and obviously, you know, magnetism. These were ones that that incorporated, I would say, the classical physics of Newton and so on. So they went beyond them. They may have introduced new premises and maybe other heuristics or methods and assumptions, but they didn't break apart the old. But postmodernism is a movement that really is a kind of critique or reaction against the old, or in this case, the modern. Whatever the modern constitutes, the postmodern is a kind of critique, a reaction to that. So you might say, to begin with, on a philosophical level, that postmodernism is a critique of what became dominant in modern philosophy, particularly European modern philosophy, where reason came to be understood as really the most precise tool we have, and the most effective at understanding anything. So as a kind of lever of knowledge. And the Enlightenment was also fundamental. So the Enlightenment held out great hopes that reason would be able to change our world in better ways, would be able to save us in a way, in the way that perhaps even a religion might save us. So in other words, solve all our problems. And it did so by developing machines. You know, it's one of the things you learn particularly too with the modern revolution of science. You see the development of machines and technologies as something we didn't really talk about when we talk about physics, but many of these developments are connected with developments in technology, breakthroughs in technologies. So these are tools, creative models also, you know, enactments of the body and attempts to understand what follows from that in describing, you know, what is observed, what is collected, what is noticed, and so on and so forth, what is registered in that system. So postmodernism, getting back to that, is a critique of, on the one hand, reason. It understands that rationality could be potentially instrumentalized, you know, and we talk about, even in political science, a means ends rationality, whereby really what prevails is this kind of utilitarian notion of, hey, I'm going to set forward really a series of propositions. If I do X, then we get Y. And so this becomes a model for essentially getting work done. You could put it and understand it in that term. You could understand it's a technology by which you know, reason is enacted in terms of setting up an antecedent and a consequent. So it is a logical system, right? It's a logical system. It is a known logical system, but it's one that postmodernism critiques because it becomes the dominant one and the only one. It becomes something that has no room for any other, if you will, logics. So rationality is understood to be instrumentalized. You know, a number of thinkers come to mind when I think about sort of the history of, or what's built upon postmodernism. You know, a guy named Weber talked about the cage of reason and rationality. So here we have in bureaucratic systems, in government, and again, these also pertain to, I would say, academic sciences, academic philosophies. We're talking about bureaucratic systems that govern the performance of you know, these acts of science or acts of rationality. So Weber understood this as being the fact of the limitation of rationality. And so many postmodernism approaches adopt, you know, the view that we need something else. We need the imagination, perhaps. We need the fictional. We need or the aesthetic in general. That rationality has for the most part crowded out other processes of thinking, even. including the imagination, maybe even intuition, some of the older ways of knowing, I would say. And so there is an attempt in a way in postmodernism to revive some of those. So postmodernism tends to, again, give far more, I would say, weight to what would be considered the particular. So even though we have relativism, you just mentioned a while ago with respect to time, we have postmodernism extending relativism, if you will. So the particular becomes most important, but also the group in a way. The group is a particular. So often postmodernism is associated with certain critiques of, social norms based upon certain groups, So there might be, for instance, a group of revolutionaries here. We might see a group of feminists here. We might see, a group of, the Black Panthers here. And though each of those sort of perspectives, they amount to different critiques of the, if you will, the universal system of reason that comes to be embodied in the state. So we can get into sort of the political aspects of this too. I think we can't divorce them, because we're not just talking about, if you will, sort of bald philosophy, or philosophy and its concepts. Philosophy and its history, I think, is really important here. And that's why I think Matrix is really interesting too, if I could just throw this into the Matrix, because what we have is, I think, a really an evolving, right, movie, if you will, or presentation. And it might go through some postmodernisms and get into that quite a bit. But I think it also maybe goes beyond the postmodernism. So I don't think postmodernism really thought about, sort of what would come next as maybe either an upgrade or an attempt to expand the way that we understand something, looking at it from different angles. So I think about the multiverse in terms of, the multiplicity of ways of seeing something. Obviously, multiverses are discrete, and maybe so discrete that they are singular. So you might have one of these. What did you call them, Pete? I think, you depicted them with these pieces of paper. You could see that perhaps each of those might be, might have their own laws, or they might have more than 4 dimensions. So there could be real diversity and uniqueness within those systems. And I think postmodernism opens that up, obviously, and it gives us room to be probably thinking in different ways about, and thinking through things in terms of different layers, maybe different dimensions as well. And again, when we're talking about thought and not reason in its pure sense as deductively valid rationality, you will probably all know that sort of formula. No, it's dominant. If A, then B. If B, then C. Therefore, if A, then C. That's a very strict, strong, and incredibly, it has a kind of utility. We can use that very effectively. And this is what we have done with computers. I mean, they are logical systems that have validity and therefore can do work, right, at enormous rates now. So, sort of getting back to the question of how postmodernism fits into this, I think that when we think about the Matrix, if we adopt a kind of frolicking, postmodernism without getting into it as any kind of dogma, I don't know if you can. I don't know if you can think of postmodernism as in any way, being restricted by any rules or, any sorts of paradigms. But if it's a paradigm unto itself, it's going to admit of a lot of different ways of seeing something. So again, relativity, you might even say, becomes really blown up. And so lastly, I would say that philosophically, there's a serious challenge to modernity's notion of any certainty or what's called epistemic certainty. So if there's no epistemic certainty, and maybe knowledge is better thought of as knowledge is. So we have indigenous knowledges, we have European knowledges, and maybe those aren't super discrete, you know, and we could find some crossover and linkage there, but they are different, right? Different knowledges, maybe again, like different universes, and perhaps like different universes, they have different rules governing them, different dimensions. Then we really are in a position of I would say, you know, going through something, experiencing something in as many different ways that we can. We don't just have one way of looking at things. And that's what's exciting also about the Matrix to me. You know, I was watching Revolutions again yesterday, and every time I turn to those, I notice something different. And I think this is the thing about anything that we find profound, or maybe even something that is about the real. The real is something that is multitudinous. And, you know, we often look at popular culture products and we know what's coming next, or we keep watching it because we like the same things all the time. But the Matrix can invite, you know, this kind of postmodern way of examining something in such a way that we get a lot more from each watch. And again, it's an observation. It's observational. And if we can be open to the idea that observation is fluctuating. So I may be a different self now than I was before when I watched The Matrix. Then one could see that I'm going to be then in a different relationship to the Matrix, right? So that idea of even connection, the idea of the connection we have with these ideas, with the visual work, you know, is a connection itself, a force that promotes this notion of seeing it, viewing it in many different ways.
Mm, totally. I definitely, that's one of the things where I think a lot of folks, when they watch the first one and then they watch the second and third, they don't get it. Or I was used to, you know, the rules of the first Matrix, what they laid out, and then it changed the rules, or what we thought was changing the rules, right? But in actuality, okay.
Can you please stop? Stop it.
All right, sorry, folks. I'm
It's
here.
Thanks for getting rid of them.
yes.
Yeah, we had some
Thanks.
disruptors. What was I saying? But in each one, they are looking at that universe, that world, in a totally different angle. And I think that's what the beauty of it, and in a way going deeper, asking a deeper question, right? And so I'm wondering, going forward, there in the first movie, you see Neo opening a book called Simulacra and Simulation. This is a real book by Jean Brugiel. I'm not even pronouncing his name, so I apologize.
Baudrillard. Yeah.
Baudrillard.
Baudrillard.
Okay. And so can you talk about what really briefly, what that book talks about, how it relates to the Matrix, and Jean actually had some issues with the first three movies, but I think, haven't seen the new movie yet, but I think that's probably resolved in the next movie. But do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's again, I'm going to try to situate it in the context of a discussion. It's another thing that strikes me as really interesting too about postmodernism or isms, is that it gives rise to, you know, the study of post-colonialism. So post-coloniality is something that shares quite a bit in common with postmodernism. Let me start at kind of, I'll go in the opposite direction if I could, to address that one. So Baudrillard talks about the sort of erasure of the real in the postmodern world. So he's describing a world in which there really is no reality, or reality is, as he says, it's deserted. You might even understand that as a kind of nihilism. And so all that we can really then know, so there's an epistemic claim here about knowledge, is what is created, what is fabricated, the artificial. This is the everything that is simulated. So you might go, the simulation, it takes on a life of its own, independent of that which it simulates, right? It is a mimetic thing. It's an imitation of something, of reality, but is not reality. And he goes so far as to say is that it doesn't just blot out reality, it doesn't just conceal it, but it overcomes it. You might even say it sucks the life out of it in a way. So the real is something that is deserted, is left over. You know, I would kind of understand it that way, a byproduct of the world becoming increasingly fabricated. So, you know, whether we're talking about, you know, the visual, or we're talking about, you know, the way in which we build, the way in which we exist, the development of our technologies accompanying that as well. And the internet, and in this, you know, forum itself, we could be talking about that as well, in terms of the made world. And, you know, this kind of goes back to Einstein when you think about this. And the quote you gave of Einstein reminds me of Nietzsche a lot as well. Because you know, Einstein saying that, you know, time, you know, reality doesn't. It was a quote about reality or time. I can't remember, Corey. But the idea is that, you know, it's not that we can talk about illusion as something that is very common. And Einstein himself talked about science as involving the cosmic religious spirit. It's a cosmic religious sort of feeling. And I would say that, you know, when we start thinking about relativity, we have to sort of build that into our understanding of what Baudrillard is getting at as well. So. So operating backwards, I would say that the Matrix, you know, sort of opens up this question of reality, but then it jams on this and overcomes this by the end. So far, the end as we know it. So the idea of revolutions as a multiplicity, many revolutions, I think is put out there. And it's not put out there as a mere fabrication. It's not put out there as just something that we imagine. It is something that is occurring, right? So I would say that although the first one, you know, introduces this idea that, you know, there is no reality, or the reality is so dried up or deadened that we can derive no meaning from it, no importance, we can't inquire into it, but rather that we're just dealing with simulation. I think this notion is overcome. And it's interesting because I understand that the sisters, the Wachowski sisters, they, and I think they would go by sisters. Correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Yep.
Yes, would they? You know, I think they begin experimenting with this, and they asked Baudrillard to actually be, you know, someone who advises on the, I think, the written portion of it. But I think that they are such dynamic filmmakers that and they are ones that evolve, that they couldn't ever be someone who, working together as a collaborating team, could ever maintain such a static notion. Like when you think about this idea of the desert of the real, or that, as Baudrillard talks about it, the reality is really nothing. So he ascribes to, you know, a kind of again, metaphysical nihilism, right? I don't think that can take you anywhere. And so one thing about Baudrillard, everything is simulated. Nothing is real. The real is defunct, is deadened. this then, is a strange statement that, if true, would suppose that, there's a position by which to make this claim, that he must have a stance somewhere, that this is a statement about reality. Yes, that reality is this way. So it as one might say, it presupposes a kind of standing outside of the simulation, something that can observe the simulation or the simulated world. And I think, if the matrix is real, this is a simulation that becomes a reality, you might even say. So that idea of a simulated reality, or a kind of surreal notion, I think, comes into play, and that allows, I think, a real dynamic sort of investigation of some of the questions that the first one brought forward. But the interesting thing for me is that there's so much of a active component about the Matrix films. There's what we're seeing for the most part are actions, and there's a lot of conflict. Obviously, there's discussion, sometimes very profound, but a series of things happening that you don't get answers to questions, I would say. You get new questions being posed. And so by the end, of the series, and I think you had mentioned this, Corey, or someone mentioned it about Morpheus. Morpheus by the end is still wondering about whether this are real or not. Morpheus is the Greek word for dream. And it sounds like it would be morph, change, mutability, but Morpheus is related to the dream world, and he's so caught up in maybe in a lucid dream that he can't see that is real. But there is a sense that reality is retained here. And so, just really briefly, the reality is that there has been an exchange between the organic and the mechanical, between that which is created and the creator, the human and the machine. And that interchange has resulted in an understanding, and therefore a peace, accord by the end. So I don't think there's potential for peace in Baudrillard. There's just there's no faint idea of any sort of harmony, even a correspondence, I think. So even though he's critical of Plato's two world ideas, right? The idea that being is hierarchical, that there's a world of appearance and a world of reality, which is the world of forms. Baudrillard posed this notion that, again, no, in our world, the appearance dominates. The aestheticon for the Greeks, the aesthetic, that which appears, dominates, and the real gets completely plowed under and is gone. But that's an interesting notion in and of itself, because we're talking about a film here that works in the realm of simulation, and you have to say the simulation is real. Why can't you just come out and accept that, or understand that the simulation is real, or that reality is broader than you think it is? That's where Baudrillard gets trapped too, this notion of the real thing versus the appearance. Because he still retains that notion of the real as, again, deadened, and we maybe can't reach it. Perhaps it's even more hidden. It's protected. The real is protected. And you might even say, well, that's interesting, because maybe we all, to some extent, in our lived experience, we're so protected from the real who of us, And we're so protected by the kinds of things that we have in colonial existence, right? Western European traditions, where the self is really just reducible to, I would say, for the most part, what you do, your identity as a worker, or abstract as a citizen. But no doubt in Europe, there is a notion of identity is uniform. So there's no sense of a real self in a way in European thinking. And if there is any sort of real self, that gets confused with the ego. So I know there were religious discussions last day, but this notion of authentic self, the notion of who you really are, and a process of discovery of who you are, is not really possible for Baudrillard. So on that level, one could be, sort of thinking that at all times one is either disillusioned about oneself, deluded about oneself, or what even one thinks about oneself is assimilation. It has no reality. So there's no potential for us to, in our journey in life, our journey and our challenges, and to think of Neo's journey, right, as someone who really does, sort of posit this notion that there's a real world, and comes to believe this in the first one. There's a real world, and then there's a fake world. There's a matrix world. Obviously, that's so different for Neo in the end. In the end, these become intertwined, interconnected. There's a notion of interbeing, right, that just sort of works its way throughout everything in the last Matrix movie. So I know I've gone into all these different strands, and I hope I haven't sort of left people behind, but I just wanted to sort of morph with that a little bit and jam with it. And I do apologize, if I did. And I'm sure I did, because I meandered quite a bit.
You meandered, but all the threads and ideas are very deep and complex and beautiful. So one of the things I want to, we got a sense of the conversation about truth, or what is real, more what is real from a philosopher. From a physicist, how do you define real? Is that something you can define?
Wow. To some degree, what you think of as reality will be in the eye of the beholder. Like I mentioned earlier, the baby version of that with just relativity, even without including gravity for Einstein's theory. If you take special relativity, even inertial observers that are in relative motion with respect to one another will definitely measure different times and different distances between phenomena and things like that. So I guess for a physicist, the whole question in some degree revolves around this question of quantum measurement theory. So what happens when we go from predicting probabilities about the future, but then doing an experiment and getting a particular result? How does the process of doing that measurement change the dynamics of the system? How does that, in the language of physics, collapse the wave function from all of the possible cohering quantum possibilities down to one actual thing that actually ends up happening? So for example, if I'm talking about the spin of an electron, if I measure it along a certain axis that can point upwards or downwards, and classically we would represent that information, if we didn't know about quantum physics, in terms of either up or down. It would be a binary choice, like a bit of information. However, in quantum physics, the electron has a cohering possibility of being in up and down states at the same time. And then what sort of degree of upness and what degree of downness there is in its wave function, the physical object that describes the quantum dynamics of the electron. When we measure it, we force the spin to be either up or down when it's measured. So we get a result, the spin up, the spin down. And if we get spin down, for example, the probability of obtaining that was determined by how much upness the wave function had versus downness, if you like. So that question of how you take the wave function between having cohering possibilities and then you collapse it down and you make it give you a result for a particular experiment in a particular detector, that whole question is very tricky. And it has to do with another phenomenon you may have heard of called Schrodinger's cat, which was an attempt by Schrodinger to show how you could scale up. What he was trying to say is how outrageous the rules of quantum mechanics really are. And he said, well, if nothing else exists in the universe except for my radioactive atom, which might decay or might not decay, if it decays, the poison gets spilled, it kills the cat. If it doesn't decay, then the cat's still alive. So quantum mechanically, until you open the box and look at the cat was in a coherent state of dead and alive. Now that particular thought experiment only works if those are the only things in the universe. In a real experiment in the lab, there would be air molecules in the box bouncing around off the cat and so forth and so on. So the decoherence of the quantum wave function into a classical result would happen a lot sooner. But this whole question of, how do we determine realities in a quantum mechanical cosmos? We have to think about, is gravity collapsing from a quantum gravity wave function into a classical space-time, which we can then use to do stuff? And oh my God, it's very complicated. So that often the stuff that happens when you're trying to figure out these kinds of questions in theoretical physics, there's a lot of brain pain involved. Can I even imagine what I really mean by reality? So, again, as with many things in mathematics, where a definition is crucial to what you can then do with that concept, in physics, how I would answer the question of what is reality, I would ask, what do you know about physics? What's your background? I'd tell my 4-year-old nephew a different answer than I would tell his 40-year-old dad. Those kind of questions, right? And it also depends on, if you're thinking about quantum gravity, which approach you're thinking about as to what kinds of questions you can ask within the context of that theory. There will be theory limitations on your ability to think about things. But then if you pick a particular theory, then you've got the question of measurement problems and so forth, and connecting theory to experiment, and that's theory specific. So sometimes the answer would only be able to be given to you in a theory specific way. The really fascinating stuff comes when you sort of learn another approach and then you realize it's relevant, and then things that other people have been thinking about turn out to be very pertinent to the questions you're worrying about. So for example, if I want to know what the subatomic structure of space-time is from an de Sitter black hole, it turns out that I can answer part of that question by knowing about some other theory. Yeah, it can get, you can get very complicated about what that question looks like according to different perspectives on the same physical system.
One of the really interesting new sciences that's coming out is what's called quantum biology, which is really blends the two. And so, for example, you have a bird who's trying to navigate, but through what the theory is, there's a lot more work to be done. The theory is through quantum mechanics allows them to navigate through the magnetic poles or whatever, right? Which is just...
Yeah, this was not even known when I was in high school. We all thought that everything in biology that was relevant to animal behavior, for example, would be mostly classical, and we didn't really have to use quantum mechanics except maybe to tell us about the structure of the molecules that are then doing their thing in chemical reactions affecting the biology, etc. Yeah. So as far as I know, we do understand now that the way birds can figure out where the magnetic field lines of the Earth are to do vast migrations, like the Arctic, like the Godwits, which go all the way from the Arctic down to New Zealand every season and then all back to the Arctic, that they navigate by making use of quantum mechanical properties of certain molecules in their systems, which allow them to do that navigation. So, but quantum biology, I would imagine, is sort of at that fuzzy borderline between classical physics and quantum physics. And the fascinating question, Schrodinger's cat was about that question. When does the classical, the things that we're familiar with, dogs, baseballs, humans, planets, stars, large things, that kind of physics that even Newton understood, how does that mesh on with the more modern, microscopic physics understanding of the quantum laws that govern silicon chips and cell phones, among other things? So it's a really fascinating question. Where is that boundary between quantum behavior and classical behavior? And sometimes is there an imprint of quantum behavior in what we then use to do things classically? Those are all very fascinating questions. So I think quantum biology is about just as far as I understand it, and I'm not a biologist, that would be about when does quantum physics leak into questions of interest to biologists? When do they have to use quantum mechanics to understand what's going on? Up until a certain period, they're like, I don't need to know that. It's a bit like particle physicists who study things in a big colliders. They have for years, we don't need to know about quantum gravity. That's completely irrelevant. That's just, angels on a pin stuff. But there's no impact on what happens inside a collider, but it actually might. And so one of the things that people are looking for at the Large Hadron Collider is whether there might be evidence of extra dimensions or even mini black holes in the collider. So yeah, these are all fascinating questions. I don't have a pat answer to the question just because it's such a sophisticated question that would require a very sophisticated answer to be more precise.
No worries. I think the beauty is that they open so many questions and doors, right? And I think that's the intention of this conversation. We don't know all the answers, right? So one of the things that that the Matrix brings up is choice versus determinism. And I'm wondering, Jeff, if you want to have a stab at
Sure.
which is true. How does it relate to the Matrix? Because they go through all the different permutations of any of those concepts.
Absolutely, that's very much so. They begin, I think, in the first with a pretty classical view of the problem, of freedom versus determinism. So, and by the end, we're all cheering for freedom. You can get out of the system. The system's inevitable. The system is fatalistic. The system has rules that so govern it that essentially compel it to a particular end, and that we can free ourselves from that. And we're all good. Yay! Right? Or we can declare liberation. But liberation is not a simple thing. So I would say that by the time you get to the end, so just jump to the end, you really have this such a, if you were to, maybe I'll put it in this way, that if you were to simply document the number of times that the word freedom or inevitability, choice and freedom were mentioned, and the number of times inevitability was mentioned in the last film, I think you'd get quite a few. So you get these two side by side, and so building on the Schrodinger, the Schrodinger's cat, sort of thought experiment, which resulted in a paradox, essentially. Before that state is defined and limited, you have the cat both dead and alive. And the thing is that maybe the choice is only when you open that lid, but that is already prescribed in some way. So I'm fascinated with the potential that the two are not at odds, that the contradiction is not this static one. Going back to postmodernism, a lot of thinkers in modernity believe that contradictions would throw up a resolution, or if you will, that things in positions of opposition, thesis, antithesis, would collide. There would be, an alteration. We think of Marx in this way, class conflict, and a new synthesis would arise and would overcome that opposition. Well, here you have an opposition, a paradox, or a contradiction that doesn't seem to just go away, but keeps going. So I think the Matrix plays around with the problem itself. And the problem itself then becomes not just a problem. Once again, we tend to think of contradictions as potential of them ending in stalemate. And Einstein, in a lot of his conversations with those on the quantum mechanics side, they just sustained this kind of consistent bashing of heads, and it didn't end. And I don't think that a lot of people would say that's meaningful, but maybe that is meaningful. Maybe just the fight has a meaning that we don't understand. The fight is an attempt, and it may go on a long time, as the war might have gone on in the Matrix films a long time. But that battle might just keep going, and we might think of it again as not resolving, it being stagnant. And I think the Matrix puts into question the very nature of problems. Again, and you might think of this from the vantage point of again quantum mechanics, typically, as I understand it, that again we can think differently about that problem as something that is thrown up by that system. Well, how are we observing that system? It's fascinating to be thinking about the way in which we, in our observation of or attempt to get data using our experimental methods and our tools, how we alter that which we are observing. And it may not just be a matter of limiting the possibilities, but the limitation itself being both a choice and inevitability, right? In other words, this is inevitable because it's going to happen insofar as I have to observe something. And you might even say that you've brought the problem to an end, or you've decided on one solution of many, right? And that's where the Matrix 3 ends. Here we have one potential, sort of if you will, a resolution, a piece of cord, a way in which we can connect, if you will, the two worlds, the world of the humans, if you will, Zion, and the world of the machine city and Zion. Or another way to think about it is that all we're doing is we're producing one way in which these two are interconnected. So when you think about peace, you could also think about it as being a kind of thing that is settled, is maybe inevitable that there will be these periods, but it's also something that admits of a freedom. And classical philosophy particularly, this struggles with problems as if they're sort of insurmountable. If they can't be surmounted, we give them up. So I'll give you an example, of a case where this is not the coming from perhaps a very well-known philosopher, Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant is sort of the Copernicus of philosophy, because Copernicus changed our focus in terms of seeing our universe. Well, Kant was a Copernican in a way because he changed our focus in understanding the problem of knowledge. So he said, what if we suppose there is no problem? The problem is gone. Now think about this, the power of the imagination, the power of the mind as itself a framework. So everything is contingent on that. What do you bring to the problem, right? What mentality? And why can't you simply say, we have no problem. All that we really need to know is why there is knowledge, how it comes about. So there's no longer a problem of knowledge. So Kant understood that there had been this problem of knowledge in the history of philosophy, and the problem of knowledge seems to be fairly basic. That either we don't know at all, and everything is relative, everything is you might even say probable. Or we do have certainty, right? So there is a kind of this problem might be considered a problem, not so much about determinism of freedom, but the idea of knowledge as if we have it, we have certitude, or if we can't get certitude, we have no knowledge whatsoever. So he just said, that problem is not getting us anywhere. We have to find a way right out of that problem. And that's what the Matrix is, seems to me, that we have this incredibly imaginative film about how problems are surmounted, overcome. Neo himself is a problem. In the end, you see, blinded, like the seer that Oedipus becomes in classical drama. Greek drama, and he becomes a seer of energy, you know. So that's another kind of thing that's introduced here, this other dimension of where, you know, the source, this maybe field of energy. I take it to be love maybe as another force that perhaps we don't always see, but we feel, right? And but maybe we do see it. Maybe it's just, again, coming at whatever the problem is from a very different way, seeing the problem as something that requires compassionate understanding, you know, or as Gabor Mate talks about, this compassionate curiosity, right? So the problem seems to not just dissolve, but take on new dimensions. And the problem itself, you know, and you might think of it this way, you know, we adopt this model of cure. You know, you got something, you got to be cured of it. You got a problem, you got to be saved from it. You know, and you know, right? And I think about this in terms of conversion therapy. Thank goodness, you know, we have this, like, bring an end to conversion therapy here in Canada, but hopefully that will do something. But you know, this idea that, you know, you essentially, you know, you force something into a certain shape, and you then look around it and you see, that's a problem, and you don't understand that you've made the problem, you see. So if you can make the problem, you can remake the problem. And maybe again, the problem is something vital. It moves us. It challenges us. We need those. But it's like any obstacle, you know, that for the sake of it being an obstacle we require, we need to overcome it. We need to supersede it. You know, I spoke about Kuhn, the idea of a paradigm shift is really about superseding it. It's about an enlarged rationality that is able to contain the whatever is anomalous to it, or you know, antagonistic to it. It can take it in and not be disturbed. Isn't that love, though, man? You take in what is there. All that is there, you accept, and you do not then banish it. You don't, therefore you've taken a problem and instead you've made it into, you know, and it is a cliche, an opportunity for a creative event. And I would take physics to be that as well, you know, riding on modern physics, riding on the idea we have problems. And really, again, as it was done, I think, by Einstein, talked about what he was doing as wild speculation, metaphysical speculation. This is something that a phenomenologist, a French phenomenologist, talks about. And I think it's a time, that sort of time as well. Our wild speculation is also a time of expanding mindfulness. So, you know, I'm reading this one work now. It's called The Sense of Being Stared At, by a guy named Rupert Sheldrake. I don't know if any of you have heard of him, but he talks about the evidence, increasing evidence now we have of, again, thought transmission, what we'd consider telepathy. I mean, I know of that because I play music with people. There's telepathy, also conversations with people. There's a great amount there as well being transferred. But he talks about the mind as something being expansive. It's not simply, again, reducible to brain. So he you know, understands there's a role for materialism, but the mind is not reducible to the brain, and it expands outward. And its outwardness is part of what it does. And we talk about this as intentionality in phenomenology. Consciousness is consciousness of something that go out into the world. Now, we are about to see whether we can get into our atmosphere and unfold, I think it is unpack or unfold, a new telescope that's going to allow us as an ultraviolet or infrared mirror is going to be able to provide us with incredible images. I mean, this is supposed to be a telescope 100 times more powerful than the Hubble. So this is an extension of mind and body into space in a way. So that obviously affects what we see, right? What we understand. But what we don't are yet to kind of understand is the extent to which that is us, man. right? That the human as a human species, as a maybe even as a kind of collective mind, because science is a collective thing, that we are going these places. And we are attempting to understand these things, but we're still not really catching up to that. And maybe, Pete put it really well, that you have, within any theory, you need to have a place for the human being. I would go so far as to say, whatever sort of premises you have to make such room for the human being that you can allow for vast change and something really profound, even soul, within your science, within what you're doing, within your theories and within your practices. So yeah, I mean, I think it's, I probably said enough about
that was lots.
So freedom and determinism, I could go back to that and kind of find a way back into that. But, there's a sense in which, yeah, there's something fatalistic, you might even say fateful, about the development of our science into these technologies. And what's fateful about that is that we understand that we are always choosing creatures. And here,
so I'm going to jump in because you had lots of beautiful things, but I want to ask Pete one more question before we open it up to the audience. So from, because one of the things I did want to talk about, because you did allude to the movie Interstellar, we kind of has the conversation about maybe love is another force. And we have nothing to base that on other than personal experience, right? But it is something really powerful that it impacts all of us in one way or another, right? And at least in theory, all of the different faith organizations are grounded in that, right? But I wanted to come back to Pete, and from a scientific perspective, and maybe this isn't something you can answer either, but from a scientific perspective, can you answer the question, is there choice or is it determinism?
Well, first I can mention again that idea of quantum determinism that physicists came up with after recognizing that classical clockwork determinism isn't correct in terms of describing the universe. So anytime there can be any quantum mechanical phenomenon, there is, as I mentioned earlier, a fundamental randomness built into quantum mechanics, so that if you do a measurement, you really aren't going to be able to tell ahead of time what the result is going to be. So just from my own perspective, once I understood that idea of quantum determinism means that I can compute probabilities of what are happening in the future with great precision. I can be confident about the probabilities, but until I could, say, run the experiment a million times and check what the probabilities of things, did the statistics line up as I would have expected for those million experiments, we can't really do that with the cosmos. We can't sort of press the go button again and run the universe machine, and press the go button again and run the universe machine, get some different results and all that kind of thing. There is just one cosmos in which we're doing all of these experiments. So I would say, just based on my understanding of how we superseded the idea of clockwork determinism with classical determinism with quantum determinism within the physicist mindset, even that would, I would think, lead towards there not being absolute determinism about what's going to happen to me in my future. Now, when I'm walking through the universe, I'm doing classical things. I'm using my hands, I'm choosing to take a sip of this. This is very much classical physics that is dominant in dynamics. Some people have wildly speculated that quantum gravity might be relevant to the physics of the brain. One of the most prominent of them is Sir Roger Penrose, who also was co-awarded the 2020 Nobel Prize in Physics for co-discovering the fact that singularity developing curvature singularities is generic for a situation in general relativity if you run things forward for long enough. The big question, circling back to Interstellar, for instance, if I have a big star and it collapses eventually to form a black hole, which has a singularity at the center, what actually is happening at that singularity? Einstein's equations of general relativity actually cannot tell us. They fall flat on their face there and they can't describe the physics. So we don't even know whether the singularity of a black hole is truly four-dimensional. So there might be other dimensions of physics that are pertinent, and what we would mean here technically is dimensions of space that could be pertinent to the question of what happens at the heart of a black hole. I think Chris Nolan's speculation in Interstellar was basically pure Hollywood script writing, not really based in physics. There, that the fifth dimension was love. That was what you used to transmit between the disconnected, universes or whatever. And one thing I will mention about that film is that they spent, a significant fraction of the budget of the film on using supercomputers to draw the pictures of what a light around a rotating black hole would look like. So about half that film was actually real science. And then the other half was like science fantasy, not science fiction or science. I think, reducing everything to the mechanical, physical way of thinking about the world. Yes, love is reducible, is it, to molecular urges that happen within our bodies and everything else. But, even if we understood it at the microscopic scale and said we understood all the physics that led to these phenomena, I think that's a bit useless in thinking in those terms, because what we're seeing, for example, in the development of imagination and of societies and all of that, are emergent phenomena that happen when you've got lots of constituents. When you've got a large number of participants, you can have qualitatively new phenomena emerging that were not even properties of the individuals who were doing the individual things. And this is called emergence in the physics literature, and it's incredibly interesting. I would also say, just circling back to something that Jeff said, that sometimes if we've got a problem and we can imagine it, say, in the Western Eurocentric philosophy tradition, then something that is a big problem there might be resolvable in a different epistemology, different ways of thinking, that maybe it's even the wrong question to be asking about the thing that's really important. And so, for example, having people well-versed in different knowledge systems, for example, somebody who knows a lot about indigenous knowledges might think about a particular problem of society in a very different way. The whole framing of it would be different. The questions you would want to ask would be different. The kinds of solutions you might be looking for to resolve that problem, what would be called a resolution of the problem even, can be very different based on those incredibly different life ways and legal orders and all that kind of thing. Right? So we could say that right now, given that white supremacist, capitalist, cis heteropatriarchy is the way that much of the economics of the world works, and that we can't resolve climate change, it's just inevitable and we should just learn to live with it. Well, that's a failure of imagination of the grossest proportions. We want to drive the planet off a cliff just because we can't imagine living without capitalism? I mean, come on, seriously. So I think dimensions of imagination and dimensions of thought, even if they don't happen to correspond to physical dimensions of space that I get obsessed by, but there I think opening up other dimensions of thought, other new directions in which we might try to move, those are all really fascinating questions. And maybe what we think of as everything that we're doing today in this call, maybe this is all just a simulation that somebody else is running on another computer. It's really a fascinating question. Could we ever know that? Computationally speaking, look at quantum information theoretic constraints. Could we know about it if it was the case? And some people address that kind of question in their research, and I'm not an expert in that. But I think probably good to stop, because I'd like to field some questions when it's my turn. So thanks for being willing to listen to me go blah, blah, blah.
Thank you both. Yeah, we could be here all day, all week, kind of ask these questions, because each point dives into a different rabbit hole of conversation, which is part of the excitement. So yes, if folks have any questions, please put them into the chat and I will ask them. And yeah. While we're waiting, one of the interesting things, and we don't necessarily have time to go down this rabbit hole, but kind of coming off of what Pete said, there's a really interesting research project in the States, I can't remember where Buddhism, for example, has been studying consciousness, and that since the beginning of Buddhism, really before that. And so they paired up with scientists to actually do research on you know, is consciousness actually a physical thing, or is it something extending beyond that, right? And obviously in that study, there's a lot of really fascinating results from that. But I think the beauty of what you're leading to is these two wisdom, or Western scientific methodology and the wisdom of Buddhism emerging together. Can we find something much more fundamental? And if there is, can we come to terms with that, right? And I think that's what those kind of experiments are asking ourselves. So, yeah. Any questions, Daryl? Do you have any questions? You usually have tons of questions on these panels.
I've been listening, but I'm so sleepy today. My brain's just not up to it.
No worries, no worries.
Well,
Anyone else have any questions? I know we really went down the rabbit hole today, which is awesome. And some of the concepts are probably like, hey, I need to process what has just been said, because I was just thrown a lot at me today. You know, I'm lucky because I've had my foot in both arenas, so I kind of have a good idea of what's been talked about. But for a lot of folks, this could be like, my brain is gonna explode. Well, maybe while we're waiting, if anybody comes up, maybe we can talk about, we've got about 15 minutes, and then we'll probably do some closing, and then I'll remain for an hour if people want to still chat or whatever. Last couple of times people haven't, but I know in previous events people have wanted to remain and connect and those kind of things. The conversation of the relationship between humans and machines, you brought this up, Jeff, a lot of times, right? And I know in science, this is a necessity, you know, machines, computer technology, right? I watch a lot of videos on the upcoming science, and they're bringing 3D simulations, for example, so you can view like a nebula from a three-dimensional perspective, or what's going on in an atomic structure. So visually, we can see something at a greater degree, at least from the perception of what we know from physics or whatever at this time. On the flip side, we have, as I think Jeff alluded to, this relationship to technology, the internet, which on one end has allowed us to connect at a greater level like we are today. But on the flip side, it has created this sense of illusion and disconnection in a whole different way. So you don't know what is, you know, a fact anymore, right? We don't know how to differentiate, you know, in our media, for example, capitalist, MSN, Fox News, all of that is filtered through a profit margin. So all the news and things that they perpetuate is from that lens. So you're not getting the full truth, if not truth that is twisted. And so how do we, like, here's this complicated relationship that we personally have with technology and machines. How do we reconcile that? Can we reconcile that, as Jeff kind of hinted at? Maybe Jeff, really quickly. I know you can go a long time, but can you make your comments short?
For sure, there's a lot of mind-body stuff here. Mind-body stuff, I would consider it. So again, maybe that's the metaphor here, is that the machine is an externalized mind-body. It's doing things that are intelligent external to us. And so we're out of body and out of mind in a machine. And you can see the potential for us to be out of that. Like, again, cut off, fragmented, maybe even, again, it brings up this postmodern sense and feeling that we are fragmented or cut off and disconnected, as you have spoken of. So I would say that, you know, our capacity to know ourselves is at stake here, that we are these out of body, out of mind beings. And we need to get into that. so that we understand what that is. So, you know, if we were to take on an exoskeletal thing, you know, like Iron Man, I mean, we would be taking on something external to our bodies, but something that we can be in as a mind. And I'm not sure that we're there yet. So that to me is the thing. It's not, the problem is an opportunity for a decision or an actuality. So the choice you presented here, again in this you know, so sort of Schrodinger state of coherence, and then the limits of that, pinning it down, is really just that. You know, we have understood the problem as this one between organic and the artificial. We've set up this problem in such a way as to alienate ourselves from what we've created. And then we need to go back into what we have created to find ourselves. The post-humanists talk about this. You know, there's something to that, something to the idea that we need to really be thinking about ourselves as out of it, out of body, out of mind, but also in body in a new way. And I understand that as also a mind-body problem, because if we were in our bodies in the right way, we would know this is how we are in a body in the world, up in space, in a telescope. We made that. We're in that, right? So that's how to understand it. So in the Matrix, you have, particularly in the last movie, this extraordinary notion of the mechanical taking on organic movement. And you see these beings who come into Zion, and they are moving like a school of fish. They are collective. This is something that Pete, you talk about in terms of this, an idea of emergence, this collectivity that happens. And what happens is the collectivity takes on this life of its own, whether we talk about it in human terms or in machine terms. So we are talking about probably in the nature of reality, that the nature of reality is something that begins in a singular way and then starts differentiating. And so differentiating at rates and ways that we can't, that only maybe imagination can really cover and track, right?
Yeah.
So that's how I would kind of get this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. Pete, do you want to jump in on that?
I think he's probably said already more than I would have said. So I'm not an expert in philosophy, and I don't want to claim that I am. I'm a natural philosopher, i.e. a physicist who has an interest in these topics, but I wouldn't say I'm well enough versed in modern philosophy or you know, some body of traditional philosophy either to be able to comment definitively. I personally, just from learning from other disabled people, I always talk about my body-mind as one thing, because I don't feel that I can separate the actions of those two things from each other. For a long time, I dissociated a lot to deal with chronic pain and with gender dysphoria. And so I felt like I thought I could live just in my brain and kind of ignore whatever was happening body-wise. And, you know, I took basic care of it, but mostly ignored it and didn't listen to it. And well, over the years, I've learned that I can't really afford to be doing that, and it's not healthy for me. So maybe other people are better at separating what goes on in their mind from what goes in their body. But at my age and with my set of injury histories, I can't do that anymore.
Thank you. Yeah, I guess in terms of mind body, like as a therapist and somebody who teaches mindfulness, that is such a critical thing. We still have a hard time teaching people how to connect with their body and know that there's more going on there than just their thoughts. And then we can go down the rabbit hole. Even our thoughts are an illusion. They're not real, and to what complicated mess that can be, right? And as for trans people, our bodies are such a complicated place because of our dysphoria and our relationship with bodies, and that conversation. When I support people, how do you get people to connect with their bodies? Let's say their dysphoria is a 9 or a 10. That's going to be really difficult. right? I have a pretty low dysphoria rate, so it's not that difficult, but yet acknowledging, connecting to your body. We live in our body. Whether this world is an illusion or not, we have to go day to day living in our bodies, right? And valuing that, right? And it's such an important piece for, I think, everyone to learn, and that our relationship with our bodies is so important, right? So
I actually learned about this doing a mindfulness-based chronic pain course at one of the local hospitals run by somebody who's quite an expert in both traditional pain medicine, Western style, and also got qualified in doing this mindfulness meditation stuff. And that was a huge breakthrough for my little body-mind consciousness to make, and it's helped a lot.
awesome.
Yeah.
I'm always happy to hear when people integrate all of those things together and it has changed their lives. Yes. So I think it's time. I'm just trying to think if we should just go with yeah, let's just close things off. Annie, do you want to do your final announcing?
Sure, no problem. Sorry. All right, so so we'd like to thank pardon me. We'd like to thank Christy for being available to for tech support and setting up our movie today. Also to Nicola for being our chat moderator, Rebecca for being available for cultural and emotional support, as well as all the panelists who shared their thoughts and feelings about these mind-bending topic. That's true. So, to Corey for organizing and setting up these amazing watch parties and panels, and also all the audience members who just participated, and the audience will be watching the recordings of the panels as well.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for everyone. And just so everyone knows, on the 30th, when we have a team meeting, we will draw who's the winner of the contest. And then we will also, whatever happens with the final panel, we will let everyone know probably around February. The positive thing about the pandemic is it does force everyone online and does streamline things to more of the online venues. So that maybe make it easier for us to set up the last panel, but we will keep everyone apprised. And I think that's all I have to say. I want to say thank you again to Dr. Pete and Jeff Vansha for joining us and having such a real dive into the rabbit hole in many different places. And I quite enjoyed this conversation, and I hope everyone else has. So yeah, so if we can give them a round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you.